The grand ballroom of Ashworth Manor glittered with crystal chandeliers and the rustle of silk gowns, but Lady Eleanor Whitmore sat alone at a corner table, watching her younger sister dance with the man who was supposed to be her husband. The wedding she had dreamed of had become her nightmare, and every laugh from the crowd felt like a dagger to her heart. Just as the humiliation threatened to consume her entirely, a deep voice whispered behind her, "Pretend you're with me." She turned to find the most notorious duke in England, extending his gloved hand, his dark eyes holding secrets that would change everything. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Lady Eleanor Whitmore had always been told she was the fortunate one. Born into one of England's most distinguished families during the height of the Victorian era, she possessed everything society deemed valuable: porcelain skin that had never known labor, golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, and eyes the color of summer violets. At 22, she was considered past the first bloom of youth, yet her beauty remained undeniable. The Whitmore estate in Gloucestershire stretched across rolling hills, dotted with ancient oaks, its Georgian manor house standing proud against the English countryside. Eleanor's days followed the prescribed rhythm of a lady's life. Morning correspondence in the morning room overlooking the rose gardens, afternoon calls with her mother, Lady Margaret, and evenings spent at her embroidery while her father read aloud from the Times. "Eleanor, darling, do sit straighter," her mother would remind her daily. "Lord Ashworth expects perfection in a wife, and we mustn't disappoint him." Lord Ashworth. The name had dominated Eleanor's life for 3 years, ever since her father had arranged the match. Richard Ashworth, heir to the Earl of Pemberton, possessed everything the Whitmores valued: an ancient title, vast estates, and connections that reached the highest echelons of society. He was handsome in the classical sense, with sharp features and auburn hair that gleamed in candlelight. Yet something in his pale blue eyes had always made Eleanor's skin crawl. During their chaperoned visits, he would speak to her as if she were a prized mare he was considering for purchase, discussing her accomplishments with the same tone he used for his hunting dogs. "Your needlework is adequate," he had pronounced during one particularly memorable afternoon tea. "Though I trust you'll improve once we're married. My mother expects the finest embroidery from the ladies of our family." Eleanor's younger sister, Charlotte, barely 18 and possessed of a more vivacious beauty, would flutter around during these visits like a butterfly seeking attention. Where Eleanor was thoughtful and reserved, Charlotte was all laughter and bright chatter. She had inherited their mother's talent for saying exactly what men wanted to hear. "Oh, Lord Ashworth," Charlotte would giggle, "you're so terribly clever. Eleanor is so lucky to have captured your attention." The wedding had been planned with military precision. Lady Margaret had spent months coordinating with the finest dressmakers in London, ensuring Eleanor's gown would be the talk of the season. The ceremony was to take place at Ashworth Manor, followed by a grand reception that would host 300 of England's most influential families. Eleanor's wedding dress hung in her wardrobe like a beautiful ghost, its ivory silk and Brussels lace representing everything she was supposed to want. Yet each time she looked at it, she felt as though she were staring at her own burial shroud. "You should be grateful," her mother reminded her constantly. "Lord Ashworth could have chosen any young lady in England. Your father has secured your future admirably." But Eleanor's dreams had always been different. She devoured books from her father's library, losing herself in tales of adventure and romance. She imagined a love that would set her soul on fire, a partnership of minds and hearts, rather than a mere transaction between families. In her secret moments, she would stand at her bedroom window overlooking the moors and wonder what lay beyond the carefully constructed boundaries of her world. The night before her wedding, Eleanor sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by trunks packed with her trousseau. Her lady's maid, Mrs. Hartwell, bustled about making final preparations. "You'll be the most beautiful bride England has seen in years, my lady," Mrs. Hartwell said kindly, though Eleanor detected a note of sadness in the older woman's voice. "Will I be happy, Mrs. Hartwell?" Eleanor asked quietly, voicing the question that had haunted her for months. The maid paused in her folding, her weathered hands stilling on a silk chemise. "Happiness, my lady, sometimes comes in forms we don't expect. Perhaps Lord Ashworth will surprise you." But even as Mrs. Hartwell spoke the words, neither woman believed them. Eleanor had seen the way Richard looked at Charlotte during family gatherings, his eyes following her sister's graceful movements with an intensity that never appeared when he gazed upon his intended bride. The morning of her wedding dawned grey and drizzling, as if the English sky itself mourned what was to come. Eleanor stood before her mirror as Mrs. Hartwell fastened the tiny pearl buttons that ran up the back of her gown, each one feeling like a shackle being locked into place. "There now," Mrs. Hartwell whispered, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "You look like an angel, my lady." Eleanor stared at her reflection, seeing a stranger in bridal white. The woman in the mirror looked perfect, untouchable, and utterly lifeless. As carriages began arriving at Ashworth Manor and the sound of guests filled the air, Eleanor felt the walls of her golden cage closing in around her. What she didn't know was that this day would indeed change her life forever, just not in the way anyone expected. For in the shadows of Ashworth Manor, a scandal was brewing that would shatter her carefully ordered world and force her to discover who she truly was beneath the layers of expectation and propriety. But first, she would have to survive the most humiliating moment of her life, witnessed by the very people who had spent years telling her how fortunate she was to be chosen. The ancient chapel at Ashworth Manor had witnessed centuries of unions, its stone walls echoing with the vows of generations past. Gothic arches soared overhead, their shadows dancing in the light of hundreds of candles that flickered like earthbound stars. The pews were filled with England's finest families, their silk gowns and mourning coats creating a tapestry of wealth and privilege that stretched from the altar to the heavy oak doors. Eleanor stood at the back of the chapel, her arm linked through her father's, feeling as though she were walking toward her own execution rather than her wedding. The ivory silk of her gown rustled with each step, the Brussels lace veil that had belonged to her grandmother flowing behind her like a river of memories. The scent of white roses and orange blossoms filled the air, their sweetness almost cloying in the confined space. Lord Whitmore squeezed her arm gently. "You look radiant, my dear," he whispered, though his voice carried a tremor that suggested even he harbored doubts about this union. "Remember, you're doing your duty to the family." Duty. The word had governed Eleanor's entire life, and now it would seal her fate forever. As they began their procession down the aisle, Eleanor's eyes found Richard standing at the altar in his perfectly tailored mourning coat, his auburn hair gleaming in the candlelight. He looked every inch the perfect English gentleman, his posture rigid with aristocratic bearing. Yet something in his expression made her stomach clench with unease. His pale blue eyes weren't fixed on her approaching figure with the adoration of a groom. Instead, they kept darting to the front pew where Charlotte sat beside their mother. Charlotte looked breathtaking in her bridesmaid's gown of pale blue silk, her dark curls arranged in an elaborate coiffure that showcased her graceful neck. She wore the sapphire necklace that had been their grandmother's, the stones catching the light with each breath. When Eleanor's eyes met her sister's, Charlotte offered a smile that seemed somehow too bright, too knowing. The ceremony proceeded with the ancient ritual that had bound countless couples before them. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself had come to perform the service, his voice resonating through the chapel as he spoke of love, honor, and fidelity. Eleanor repeated her vows in a voice that sounded foreign to her own ears, each word feeling like a stone dropping into a deep well. "Do you, Richard Edmund Ashworth, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. Eleanor felt 300 pairs of eyes upon them, waiting for the words that would bind her to this man forever. Richard's jaw worked silently, his gaze once again finding Charlotte in the front pew. Richard began, his voice cracking slightly. The chapel held its collective breath. I cannot. The words fell like thunder in the sacred space. Gasps rippled through the congregation like stones thrown into still water. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her suddenly nerveless fingers. I beg your pardon, the Archbishop asked, his elderly face creased with confusion and growing alarm. Richard straightened his shoulders, and when he spoke again, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the chapel. I cannot marry Lady Eleanor Whitmore. My heart belongs to another. The chapel erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. Eleanor stood frozen at the altar, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This had to be some terrible nightmare from which she would soon awaken. But Richard wasn't finished. With the cruelty that only comes from absolute certainty, he turned to face the congregation, his voice rising above the chaos. I am deeply in love with Lady Charlotte Whitmore, and she with me. We have been conducting a courtship of the heart for the past 6 months, and I can no longer deny what we both know to be true. Eleanor's world tilted on its axis. She turned to look at Charlotte, praying to see shock and denial on her sister's face. Instead, she found Charlotte rising gracefully from her seat, her cheeks flushed with excitement rather than shame. It's true, Charlotte announced, her voice carrying the musical quality that had always charmed everyone around her. Richard and I have discovered a love that cannot be denied. We tried to fight it, truly we did, but the heart wants what it wants. The chapel had descended into complete chaos. Ladies were fanning themselves frantically, while gentlemen muttered in outrage. Eleanor's mother had gone deathly pale, her gloved hands pressed to her mouth in horror. Lord Whitmore's face had turned an alarming shade of purple as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the scandal unfolding before England's most prominent families. This is preposterous, Lord Whitmore thundered, his voice cutting through the din. Richard, you are contracted to marry Eleanor. The settlements have been signed. Richard's expression hardened with aristocratic arrogance. Contracts can be broken, sir. I will not be forced into a loveless marriage when true passion exists elsewhere. Charlotte and I will be married as soon as the banns can be read. Eleanor felt as though she were drowning in plain sight. The beautiful chapel, the flowers, the candlelight, everything that was supposed to represent the happiest day of her life had become the stage for her complete humiliation. 300 of England's most influential people were witnessing her rejection, her abandonment, her sister's betrayal. Eleanor, Charlotte said, approaching her with what appeared to be genuine concern, but felt like salt in an open wound. Please try to understand. We never meant for this to happen. Love simply cannot be commanded or controlled. The hypocrisy of it struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Charlotte spoke of love as if it were some noble force, when what she had done was steal her sister's intended husband through months of secret meetings and whispered promises. The sapphire necklace at Charlotte's throat seemed to mock Eleanor. Even their grandmother's jewelry looked better on her younger sister. You knew, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the continuing chaos. You knew this would happen, and you let me stand here in front of everyone. We hoped you would understand, Richard said, though his tone suggested he cared very little whether she understood or not. You're an intelligent woman, Eleanor. Surely you must have realized that what we had was merely an arrangement. What Charlotte and I share is real love. The Archbishop, clearly out of his depth in such unprecedented circumstances, was attempting to restore order. Perhaps we should adjourn to discuss this matter privately. No, Richard interrupted. Let it be known publicly. I will not live a lie, and neither will Charlotte. We are to be married, and that is final. Eleanor looked around the chapel at the sea of faces, some shocked, some scandalized, some already gleaming with the anticipation of spreading this delicious gossip throughout London society. She saw Lady Pemberton, Richard's mother, looking as though she might faint from the social catastrophe unfolding before her. She saw the Duke of Wellington's widow shaking her head in disgust. She saw young ladies whispering behind their fans, their eyes bright with the cruel excitement that comes from witnessing another's downfall. The weight of her wedding gown suddenly felt unbearable. The Brussels lace that had seemed so beautiful that morning now felt like a shroud. The ivory silk, a mockery of the purity and joy a wedding dress was meant to represent. Her carefully arranged hair was beginning to come loose, blonde tendrils escaping to frame her face in a way that made her look even more vulnerable. "I need air," Eleanor managed to say, though she wasn't sure anyone heard her above the continuing uproar. She turned and fled down the aisle, her silk skirts rustling with each desperate step. The heavy chapel doors seemed impossibly far away, and she could feel hundreds of eyes following her retreat. Behind her, she heard her mother calling her name, heard her father's voice raised in furious argument with Richard, heard Charlotte's musical laughter as she accepted congratulations from guests who were already switching their allegiance to the new couple. Eleanor burst through the chapel doors into the grey afternoon, the cool air hitting her flushed cheeks like a benediction. The manicured gardens of Ashworth Manor stretched before her, their autumn colours muted under the overcast sky. She stumbled down the stone steps, her wedding slippers sliding on the damp stones, her veil catching on the ornate balustrade. Behind her, the chaos continued to spill from the chapel as guests emerged in clusters, their voices carrying on the autumn wind. She could hear fragments of conversation. Absolutely scandalous. Poor Eleanor. What will society say? The Whitmore family is ruined. Ruined. The word echoed in her mind as she made her way across the terrace toward the manor house. Her reputation, her future, her very identity, everything had been destroyed in the space of 10 minutes. She was no longer Eleanor Whitmore, the fortunate bride. She was Eleanor Whitmore, the woman so undesirable that her own sister had stolen her intended husband. The reception that was to have celebrated her marriage now loomed before her like a torture chamber. The ballroom was decorated with thousands of white roses and trailing ivy, the tables set with the finest china and crystal. A wedding cake that had taken the kitchen staff 3 days to create stood in magnificent splendor, its sugar flowers and delicate piping a monument to dreams that would never be realized. Eleanor paused at the entrance to the ballroom, her reflection caught in the gilt mirrors that lined the walls. She looked like a ghost in her wedding finery, pale and ethereal and utterly lost. The woman staring back at her bore little resemblance to the confident young lady who had awakened that morning, believing she knew exactly what her future held. As the first guests began to filter into the ballroom, some out of morbid curiosity, others simply because they didn't know what else to do, Eleanor realized that her ordeal was far from over. She would have to face these people, would have to endure their pity and their whispered speculation. She would have to watch as Charlotte and Richard received the congratulations that should have been hers. But perhaps most devastating of all, she would have to figure out who she was now that everything she had been raised to be had been stripped away in front of the very people whose opinions shaped English society. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and she braced herself for another confrontation, another humiliation. But what happened next would change the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined, setting her on a path toward a destiny far greater than anything she had ever dared to dream. The footsteps belonged to a man Eleanor had never seen before, yet his presence commanded immediate attention. He was tall and imposing, with dark hair that gleamed like polished ebony and eyes the color of storm clouds. His evening attire was impeccable, cut in the latest London fashion, yet there was something untamed about him that spoke of adventures beyond the confines of English drawing rooms. Most striking of all was the thin scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, giving his aristocratic features a dangerous edge that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "Your Grace," she heard someone whisper behind her, and she realized this must be one of the notorious dukes her mother had always warned her about, the kind of man who lived by his own rules and cared nothing for society's expectations. He approached her with the fluid grace of a predator, his storm-grey eyes never leaving her face. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rich, with an accent that suggested he had spent considerable time abroad. "Lady Eleanor," he said, offering her an elegant bow, "I am Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow. I believe you are in need of an ally." Before Eleanor could respond, he extended his arm to her with the same natural authority that seemed to radiate from his very being. "Pretend you're with me," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Let them see that you are not broken by their cruelty." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before placing her trembling hand on his arm. The strength she felt there was like an anchor in the storm of her emotions, and for the first time since the chapel disaster, she felt as though she might survive this ordeal. Together, they entered the ballroom where the wedding reception had transformed into something resembling a wake. Guests clustered in small groups, their voices hushed as they dissected the scandal that would undoubtedly dominate London society for months to come. Eleanor could feel their eyes upon her as she walked beside the Duke, but somehow his presence made their stares feel less like daggers and more like mere curiosity. "Who is he?" Eleanor whispered, still struggling to understand why this stranger had chosen to rescue her. "Someone who recognizes courage when he sees it," the Duke replied, guiding her toward a quiet alcove near the French doors that led to the garden. "And someone who has little patience for the kind of cruelty you've just endured." As they settled into the relative privacy of the alcove, Eleanor became aware of the whispers that followed in their wake. The Duke of Ravenshollow was clearly a figure of considerable interest and speculation. She caught fragments of conversation: returned from India last month, made a fortune in railways, never been married. His father was quite the scandal himself. "Why are you helping me?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The shock of the day's events was beginning to wear off, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made her feel as though she might collapse at any moment. The Duke studied her with those penetrating grey eyes, and Eleanor had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through to her soul. "Because," he said finally, "I have some experience with having one's life destroyed in public. And because I suspect there is far more to Lady Eleanor Whitmore than anyone in this room realizes." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, her mother appeared at her side, her face a mask of barely controlled hysteria. Lady Margaret's usually perfect coiffure was dishevelled, and her silk gown bore the wrinkles of a woman who had been wringing her hands in despair. "Eleanor, there you are!" Lady Margaret exclaimed, though her eyes were fixed on the Duke with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. "We must leave immediately. This situation it's simply impossible." "Lady Margaret," the Duke said, rising to offer her a bow that was perfectly correct, yet somehow managed to convey a subtle challenge. "I was just offering Lady Eleanor my condolences on this unfortunate turn of events." Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed as she tried to place him. "Your Grace, I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow," he replied smoothly. "I've recently returned from India, where I've been overseeing some business interests. I was invited today by Lord Pemberton, though I confess the entertainment has been rather more dramatic than I anticipated." The mention of Lord Pemberton, Richard's father, seemed to reassure Lady Margaret somewhat, though she still regarded the Duke with suspicion. "Yes, well, as you can see, we are in the midst of a family crisis. Eleanor, we really must go." "Done." But Eleanor found herself reluctant to leave the Duke's protective presence. For the first time all day, she felt as though someone saw her as more than just a victim of circumstances beyond her control. "Perhaps," the Duke said, his voice carrying a note of authority that made Lady Margaret pause. "Lady Eleanor might benefit from a change of scenery. I have a sister, Lady Agatha Pembroke, who maintains a residence in Bath. She is a woman of considerable independence and wisdom, and I believe she would welcome Lady Eleanor as a guest while this situation settles." Eleanor's heart leapt at the suggestion. Bath was far enough from London to escape the immediate scandal, yet respectable enough that her reputation might survive the association. More importantly, it represented freedom from the suffocating atmosphere of her family home, where every room would remind her of her humiliation. "I couldn't possibly impose on a stranger," Eleanor began, but the Duke cut her off with a gentle smile. "Lady Agatha is hardly a stranger to adversity," he said. "She was widowed young and chose to make her own way in the world rather than retreat into mourning. I think you would find her company illuminating." Lady Margaret looked as though she wanted to object, but the practical advantages of the arrangement were too obvious to ignore. Having Eleanor associated with a duke's sister would help mitigate the social damage, and removing her from London would allow the scandal to die down more quickly. "It's very kind of your Grace," Lady Margaret said finally, though her tone suggested she found the Duke's interest in her daughter somewhat suspicious. "But Eleanor has obligations here." "What obligations?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than she had intended. "My wedding is over. My intended husband has married my sister in all but name. What possible obligations could I have?" The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. She had always been the dutiful daughter, the one who never questioned or complained. But standing in the ruins of her carefully planned life, she felt something stirring within her that she had never experienced before, a desire to choose her own path. "Eleanor!" Lady Margaret gasped, clearly shocked by her daughter's uncharacteristic defiance. "I think," the Duke said quietly, "that Lady Eleanor has earned the right to make her own decisions about her future. The offer stands, should you choose to accept it." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion near the ballroom entrance drew their attention. Charlotte and Richard had arrived, having apparently decided to make their appearance at what was supposed to have been Eleanor's wedding reception. Charlotte had changed from her bridesmaid's gown into a dress of deep emerald silk that made her dark beauty even more striking. She clung to Richard's arm with the possessive grace of a woman who had claimed her prize. The sight of them together, radiant with the glow of new love and seemingly oblivious to the pain they had caused, sent a fresh wave of humiliation through Eleanor. She watched as guests who had been whispering about the scandal moments before now rushed to offer their congratulations to the new couple. Society, it seemed, was remarkably quick to adjust its allegiances when presented with a fait accompli. "Look at them," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "They're actually celebrating." The Duke followed her gaze, his expression darkening with disgust. "They are celebrating their own selfishness," he said coldly. "There is no honor in what they have done, regardless of how they choose to justify it." Charlotte's laughter rang out across the ballroom, bright and musical and utterly without shame. She was holding court near the wedding cake that had been meant for Eleanor, accepting congratulations as if she were the rightful bride who had simply been delayed in claiming her place. "She's wearing grandmother's sapphires," Eleanor observed, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Mother gave them to her to wear as my bridesmaid, and now she wears them as a trophy," the Duke finished grimly. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor, do you truly wish to remain here and watch this performance? Or would you prefer to begin writing your own story?" Eleanor looked up at him, seeing something in his storm-grey eyes that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pity. She had seen enough of that today to recognize it immediately. It was something else, something that made her feel as though he saw potential in her that she had never recognized in herself. "Lady Agatha," she said slowly, testing the name on her tongue. "What is she like?" A smile played at the corners of the Duke's mouth, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish. "She is the most formidable woman I know," he said. She runs a literary salon that attracts some of the most interesting minds in England. She believes that a woman's intellect is her greatest asset, and she has little patience for those who would waste their gifts on conventional expectations. The description sent a thrill of possibility through Eleanor. She had always loved books, had always felt most alive when she was reading or discussing ideas, but such interests had been discouraged as unsuitable for a future wife and mother. "She sounds wonderful," Eleanor admitted. "She is," the Duke confirmed. "And I believe she would find you equally wonderful once you discover who you truly are beneath all these layers of other people's expectations." Lady Margaret had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Eleanor, you cannot seriously be considering running off to Bath with a man we barely know." "I'm not running off with him," Eleanor said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I'm accepting an invitation to stay with his sister. There's a considerable difference." "But what will people say?" Eleanor looked around the ballroom at the people her mother was so concerned about, the same people who were now fawning over Charlotte and Richard, the same people who had watched her humiliation with barely concealed delight. "I find," she said slowly, "that I care less and less what these people say." The Duke's smile widened. "Excellent," he said. "That is the first step toward true freedom." Obey, as if summoned by their conversation, Charlotte appeared at Eleanor's side, her face arranged in an expression of sisterly concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor, darling," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've been looking everywhere for you. We simply must talk." Eleanor felt the Duke tense beside her, his protective instincts clearly aroused by Charlotte's approach. "I believe," he said coolly, "that Lady Eleanor has heard quite enough from you for one day." Charlotte's eyes widened as she took in the Duke's imposing presence for the first time. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, offering him a smile that had charmed countless men before him. "Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow," he replied, his tone so frigid that Charlotte actually took a step backward. "And you, I presume, are the sister who has just destroyed her own family for the sake of a man who was promised to another." The colour drained from Charlotte's face at his blunt assessment. She was clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to with such direct disapproval, especially by a man of such obvious rank and consequence. "Your Grace, you don't understand," Charlotte began, but the Duke cut her off with a gesture. "I understand perfectly," he said. "I understand that you are a selfish child who has caused immeasurable pain for your own gratification. What I don't understand is why you would compound that cruelty by approaching your sister now." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who was defending her with such fierce conviction. No one had ever stood up for her like this before, and the feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Eleanor," Charlotte said, turning back to her sister with tears beginning to form in her eyes, "please don't let him turn you against me. I love Richard, truly I do, and he loves me. Surely you wouldn't want either of us to be miserable in a loveless marriage." The manipulation in Charlotte's words was so transparent that Eleanor wondered how she had never seen it before. Her sister had always been skilled at making her own desires seem like noble sacrifices. Her own needs appear to be acts of selfless love. "What I want," Eleanor said quietly, "is for you to leave me alone." Charlotte's face crumpled as if she had been struck. "Eleanor, you can't mean that. We're sisters." "Sisters don't steal each other's intended husbands," Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Sisters don't conduct secret courtships behind each other's backs. Sisters don't humiliate each other in front of 300 witnesses." "But I thought you would understand," Charlotte protested. "You're so sensible, so practical. I thought you would see that this is better for everyone." The casual dismissal of her feelings, the assumption that she would simply accept her sister's betrayal because it was convenient, finally broke through Eleanor's shock and unleashed the anger that had been building all day. "Better for everyone," Eleanor repeated, her voice rising. "Better for you, perhaps, better for Richard. But what about me, Charlotte? What about my feelings, my future, my reputation? You'll find someone else, Charlotte said desperately. Someone who truly appreciates you. Richard never did, not really. He was always looking at me, always finding excuses to speak with me. I was doing you a favor by saving you from a marriage that would have made you both miserable. The audacity of the statement left Eleanor speechless. Charlotte was actually trying to frame her betrayal as an act of sisterly kindness, as if she had orchestrated this humiliation for Eleanor's own good. "Enough," the Duke said, his voice cutting through Charlotte's protestations like a blade. "Lady Eleanor has made her position clear. I suggest you return to your new fiancée and leave her in peace." Charlotte looked between Eleanor and the Duke, clearly recognizing that she had lost this battle. "Fine," she said, her voice hardening with the petulance of a child denied her favorite toy. "But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've thrown away. Richard and I are going to be very happy together, and we won't let your jealousy spoil our joy." With that parting shot, Charlotte turned and swept away, her emerald silk skirts rustling with indignation. Eleanor watched her go, feeling as though she was seeing her sister clearly for the first time in her life. "Well," the Duke said dryly, "that was illuminating." Eleanor turned to look at him, this stranger who had appeared at her darkest moment like some sort of guardian angel. "Why?" she asked again. "Why are you helping me?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant, as if he were remembering something painful. "Because," he said finally, "I know what it's like to have your life destroyed by people who claim to love you. And because I believe that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to us turns out to be the best thing that could have happened." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight bands of despair that had been constricting her breathing all day. For the first time since the chapel disaster, she felt a tiny spark of hope. "When would I leave for Bath?" she asked. The Duke's smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Whenever you're ready to begin your new life, Lady Eleanor. The choice, for perhaps the first time, is entirely yours." As Eleanor looked around the ballroom one last time, at the wedding decorations that mocked her dreams, at the guests who whispered behind their fans, at Charlotte and Richard holding court near the cake that should have celebrated her marriage, she felt the last chains of her old life falling away. She was no longer the dutiful daughter who did what was expected of her. She was no longer the rejected bride who had been found wanting. She was Eleanor Whitmore, and for the first time in her 22 years, she was free to discover exactly who that might be. But what adventures awaited her in Bath? And what secrets did the mysterious Duke of Ravenshollow carry behind those storm-grey eyes? The answers would change everything she thought she knew about love, about herself, and about the kind of life a woman could choose to live when she finally found the courage to write her own story. 3 months had passed since Eleanor's arrival in Bath, and the transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Lady Agatha Pembroke's elegant townhouse on Royal Crescent had become Eleanor's sanctuary, a place where she could shed the suffocating expectations of her former life and discover the woman she was meant to be. Lady Agatha herself was a revelation, a woman of 55 with silver hair that she wore in a fashionable chignon and intelligent blue eyes that missed nothing. Widowed at 30, she had shocked society by refusing to remarry, and instead had used her considerable inheritance to create a life of purpose and independence. Her weekly literary salon attracted some of the most brilliant minds in England, philosophers, writers, scientists, and reformers who gathered to debate the pressing issues of the day. "My dear Eleanor," Lady Agatha had said on her first evening in Bath, "you have been living your life as if you were a character in someone else's story. It's time you became the author of your own tale." Under Lady Agatha's guidance, Eleanor had begun to bloom like a flower, finally given proper sunlight. She devoured books on philosophy, science, and literature. She attended lectures at the Royal Institution and engaged in spirited debates about women's education and social reform. Most surprisingly of all, she discovered that she had a gift for writing, Her essays on social issues were both eloquent and passionate, earning praise from Lady Agatha's distinguished guests. The physical transformation was equally striking. Gone were the pale, insipid gowns her mother had favoured, replaced by rich jewel tones that brought out the violet of her eyes and the gold of her hair. Lady Agatha's French modiste had created a wardrobe that was both fashionable and practical, suitable for a woman who spent her days in libraries and lecture halls rather than drawing rooms. But perhaps the most significant change was in Eleanor's bearing. The timid, apologetic girl who had fled from Ashworth Manor had been replaced by a confident young woman who spoke her mind with intelligence and conviction. She had learned to value her own opinions, to trust her own judgment, and to see herself as worthy of respect and consideration. It was during this period of transformation that Dr. Elias Reed entered her life. Eleanor first encountered him at one of Lady Agatha's salons, where he had been invited to speak about his work with the poor in London's East End. He was not conventionally handsome. His features were too sharp, his brown hair too unruly, his clothes too practical for fashion. But when he spoke about his mission to bring medical care to those who could not afford it, his plain face was transformed by a passion that made him utterly compelling. "The greatest tragedy of our age," he had said that evening, his voice carrying clearly through Lady Agatha's drawing room, "is not that poverty exists, but that we have convinced ourselves it is inevitable. Every child who dies of preventable disease, every woman who suffers in childbirth without proper care, every man who works himself to death in our factories, these are not acts of God, but failures of human compassion." Eleanor had found herself leaning forward in her chair, captivated not just by his words, but by the conviction behind them. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to something greater than his own comfort or advancement, who saw suffering and chose to act rather than simply observe. After his presentation, she had approached him with questions about his work, and their conversation had continued long after the other guests had departed. Dr. Reed, Elias, as he had insisted she call him, was unlike any man she had ever met. He listened to her opinions with genuine interest, challenged her assumptions without condescension, and treated her as an intellectual equal rather than a decorative object. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Whitmore," he had said as Lady Agatha's butler showed him out. "I hope we shall have occasion to continue our discussion." That occasion had come sooner than expected. Lady Agatha, with the subtle matchmaking skills of a woman who had observed human nature for 5 decades, had arranged for Eleanor to assist Dr. Reed with a charitable project he was organizing in Bath. The city's poor, while not as numerous as London's, still faced significant hardships, and Elias was working to establish a clinic that would provide free medical care. Working alongside him, Eleanor discovered a side of herself she had never known existed. She had a natural talent for organization and administration, skills that proved invaluable in coordinating the clinic's operations. More importantly, she found deep satisfaction in work that had genuine purpose, that made a real difference in people's lives. "You're wasted on drawing room conversations," Elias had told her one afternoon, as they reviewed the clinic's patient records. "You have the mind of a reformer, Eleanor. You could change the world if you set your mind to it." The compliment had sent warmth flooding through her chest, not because it flattered her vanity, but because it recognized something she was only beginning to understand about herself. She was not meant for a life of ornamental domesticity. She was meant for something larger, something that would use all of her intelligence and passion. As winter gave way to spring, Eleanor's relationship with Elias deepened into something that transcended mere friendship. He courted her not with flowers and poetry, but with books that challenged her thinking and invitations to lectures that expanded her understanding of the world. He valued her opinions, sought her advice, and treated her as a partner in his work rather than a prize to be won. "I have never met a woman like you," he had confessed one evening as they walked through the Royal Crescent Gardens. "You have the courage to question everything, to think for yourself, to choose your own path. It's extraordinary." Eleanor had felt her heart flutter at his words, but it was a different kind of attraction than she had ever experienced before. This was not the breathless infatuation of a schoolgirl, but the deep recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who saw and valued the person she was becoming. It was into this new world of intellectual stimulation and meaningful work that the Duke of Ravenshollow reappeared. Eleanor was in Lady Agatha's library, working on an essay about women's education, when the butler announced his arrival. She looked up from her writing to find Alexander standing in the doorway, and her breath caught in her throat. 3 months had not diminished his commanding presence. If anything, he seemed even more imposing than she remembered. "Your Grace," she said, rising from her desk with a smile that felt surprisingly natural. "What a pleasant surprise." "Lady Eleanor," he replied, offering her an elegant bow. "I trust Bath has been treating you well?" "Very well indeed," she said, gesturing to the papers scattered across her desk. "Lady Agatha has been the most wonderful mentor. I feel as though I'm finally discovering who I was meant to be." The Duke's grey eyes took in her transformed appearance, the confident posture, the fashionable gown in deep sapphire blue, the intelligent sparkle in her violet eyes. "The change is remarkable," he said softly. "You look like a woman who has found her purpose." "I believe I have," Eleanor replied, and was surprised by the certainty in her own voice. Lady Agatha chose that moment to sweep into the library, her face bright with pleasure at seeing her brother. "Alexander, you didn't tell me you were coming to Bath." "It was an impulse," he admitted, embracing his sister warmly. "I found myself curious about how our protégé was faring." "See for yourself," Lady Agatha said proudly. "Eleanor has become quite the sensation in our little intellectual circle. Her essay on factory conditions was published in the Bath Chronicle last week, and she's been invited to speak at the Ladies' Improvement Society next month." Eleanor felt a flush of pride at Lady Agatha's words. The essay had been her first published work, and seeing her thoughts in print had been both thrilling and terrifying. "I should very much like to read it," the Duke said, his interest clearly genuine. "Of course," Eleanor replied, moving to retrieve a copy from her desk. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt the same electric shock she had experienced at their first meeting. The Duke read her essay with the focused attention of a man accustomed to evaluating important documents. Eleanor found herself holding her breath as she watched his expression, suddenly anxious for his approval in a way that surprised her. "This is exceptional work," he said finally, looking up at her with something like amazement in his grey eyes. "Your arguments are both passionate and logical, your research thorough, your prose elegant. You have a genuine gift for this, Eleanor." The use of her Christian name sent another flutter through her chest, though she couldn't quite understand why. She had grown comfortable with Elias using her first name, but hearing it from the Duke's lips felt different somehow, more intimate, more charged with meaning. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Lady Agatha has been an excellent teacher." "I have merely provided the environment," Lady Agatha said with a knowing smile. "The talent was always there, waiting to be discovered." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Reed, who had come to discuss the clinic's progress with Eleanor. She performed the introductions with some trepidation, uncertain how the aristocratic Duke would react to the practical physician. "Dr. Reed," the Duke said, offering a respectful nod. "I've heard of your work in London. Your reputation for dedication to the poor is well known." "Your Grace is too kind," Elias replied, though Eleanor detected a slight stiffness in his manner. "I simply do what any Christian gentleman should do when faced with suffering." "Not any gentleman," the Duke corrected. "Most prefer to donate money from a comfortable distance rather than soil their hands with actual work. Your approach is far more admirable." Eleanor watched the exchange with interest, noting the subtle tension between the two men. They were polite, even respectful, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a recognition, perhaps, that they represented very different worlds and very different approaches to life. "Eleanor has been invaluable to our efforts," Elias said, his voice warming as he looked at her. "Her organizational skills and compassionate nature have made our clinic far more effective than it could have been otherwise." "I'm not surprised," the Duke replied, though Eleanor thought she detected a slight edge to his tone. "Lady Eleanor has always struck me as a woman of exceptional capabilities." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of the undercurrents flowing between the two men. It was as if they were engaged in some sort of subtle competition, each trying to establish his claim to her attention and regard. When Dr. Reed finally took his leave, promising to call on Eleanor the following day to review the clinic's accounts, the Duke watched him go with an expression that was difficult to read. "An interesting man," he said finally. "He's wonderful," Eleanor replied, perhaps more warmly than she had intended. "His dedication to helping others is truly inspiring." "Indeed," the Duke said, though his tone suggested he found Elias something less than inspiring. "And I take it you've become close." "During your work together?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication in his question. "We are friends," she said carefully. "Good friends who share common interests and values." "Of course," the Duke replied, but his grey eyes held a skeptical glint that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Lady Agatha, who had been observing this exchange with the sharp attention of a woman well versed in the complexities of human emotion, chose that moment to excuse herself. "I must speak with Cook about dinner," she said, though Eleanor suspected her departure was more strategic than necessary. "Alexander, you will stay for dinner, won't you?" "If I'm not imposing," the Duke replied. "Nonsense," Lady Agatha said firmly. "Eleanor, do entertain my brother while I'm gone. Show him the garden. The roses are particularly lovely this time of year." With that, she swept from the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the Duke for the first time since that terrible day at Ashworth Manor. The silence that followed was charged with an energy that made Eleanor's skin tingle with awareness. "Shall we?" the Duke said, offering her his arm. They walked through the French doors onto the terrace, where Lady Agatha's garden spread before them in all its spring glory. The roses were indeed magnificent, their blooms ranging from pale pink to deep crimson, their fragrance perfuming the warm afternoon air. "You seem happy," the Duke observed as they strolled along the gravel paths. "Truly happy, not merely content." "I am," Eleanor replied, surprised by how easily the admission came. "For the first time in my life, I feel as though I'm living authentically, as though I'm becoming the person I was always meant to be." "And Dr. Reed, does he play a role in this newfound happiness?" Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him, struck by something in his tone that she couldn't quite identify. "Why do you ask?" The Duke was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Because," he said finally, "I find myself concerned about your welfare. Dr. Reed seems like an admirable man, but he lives in a world very different from the one you were born to. Are you certain you understand what a life with him would entail?" Eleanor felt a spark of irritation at his presumption. "I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my future," she said coolly. "I am no longer the naive girl who needed rescuing at Ashworth Manor." "No," the Duke agreed, his voice softening. "You are not. You have become something far more remarkable, a woman of intelligence, passion and purpose. Which is precisely why I would hate to see you settle for less than you deserve." "And what, in your opinion, do I deserve?" Eleanor asked, her heart beating faster at the intensity of his gaze. The Duke stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne, something masculine and expensive that made her head spin slightly. "You deserve," he said quietly, "to be cherished not just for your goodness, but for your brilliance. You deserve a partner who can match your intellect and challenge your mind. You deserve a life of adventure and purpose, not just duty and sacrifice. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something in his words, in the way he was looking at her, that suggested he was offering more than mere advice. "And you think, Doctor, Reed cannot provide those things?" "I think," the Duke said carefully, "that Dr. Reed is a good man who would make you a devoted husband. But I also think that you have the potential for greatness, Eleanor, and I would hate to see that potential constrained by conventional expectations, even well-meaning ones." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Dr. Reed was walking up the garden path, his face flushed from hurry and his expression troubled. "Eleanor," he said, slightly out of breath, "forgive me for returning so soon, but I've just received disturbing news from London." "What sort of news?" Eleanor asked, immediately concerned. "About your family," Elias replied, his eyes flicking briefly to the Duke before returning to her face. "It seems your sister's marriage to Lord Ashworth has not been the fairy tale they expected. There are rumours of difficulties." Eleanor felt her stomach clench with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite sort through. "What kind of difficulties?" "Financial troubles, primarily," Elias said gently. "Lord Ashworth's estates are apparently heavily mortgaged, and his creditors are becoming impatient. There's talk that he may be forced to sell the family seat." The Duke's expression darkened. "And I suppose he's looking for someone to blame for his troubles." "Actually," Elias said, his tone carefully neutral, "the rumors suggest that he's looking for a way out of his current situation. There's talk that he's been making inquiries about the validity of his engagement to Lady Charlotte." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Elias said reluctantly, "that there are whispers he's considering claiming that his original contract was with you, not your sister, that perhaps the wedding ceremony was invalid due to irregularities." The implications of his words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Richard was apparently so desperate to escape his financial troubles that he was considering abandoning Charlotte and attempting to reclaim his original bride, the bride whose family connections and dowry might solve his monetary problems. "The audacity," the Duke said, his voice cold with fury. "First he humiliates you publicly, and now he thinks he can simply reclaim you when it suits his purposes." Eleanor sank onto a nearby garden bench, her mind reeling. After 3 months of building a new life, of discovering who she truly was, the spectre of her old existence was threatening to drag her back into a world she had finally escaped. "There's more," Elias said gently, sitting beside her on the bench. "Your parents have apparently been in correspondence with Lord Ashworth's solicitors. They seem receptive to the idea of reconsidering the original arrangement." "Of course they are," Eleanor said bitterly. "They never cared about my happiness, only about the family's social position and financial security." The Duke began pacing the garden path, his agitation evident in every line of his body. "This is intolerable," he said. "You cannot be bartered and traded like a piece of property. You have rights, Eleanor. You have choices." "Do I?" Eleanor asked, her voice small and uncertain. "I'm still unmarried, still dependent on my family's goodwill. If they choose to honor the original contract, then we'll fight it," the Duke said fiercely. "There are legal remedies, social pressures we can bring to bear. You are not powerless, Eleanor." Elias reached for her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "You also have other options," he said quietly. "If you were to marry someone else, someone who truly values you, then Lord Ashworth's claims would be meaningless." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the proposal in his eyes, even though he hadn't spoken the words aloud. Here was safety, security, a life of purpose and meaning, with a man who genuinely cared for her. It was everything she should want, everything that made logical sense. So why did her eyes keep drifting to the Duke, whose grey gaze held promises of adventure and passion that made her heart race with possibilities she didn't dare name? The choice before her was more than just between two men. It was between two completely different futures, two different versions of the woman she might become. And as the afternoon shadows lengthened across Lady Agatha's garden, Eleanor realized that the most important decision of her life was rushing toward her with the inevitability of an approaching storm. But which path would lead to true happiness, and which would she have the courage to choose when the moment of decision finally arrived? The news of Richard's machinations spread through Bath society with the speed of wildfire, reaching even the most exclusive drawing rooms by the following morning. Eleanor found herself once again the subject of whispered speculation, though this time the tone was markedly different. Where once she had been pitied as the rejected bride, she was now viewed with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. A woman who had risen above her circumstances only to face a new challenge with dignity and grace. Lady Agatha's breakfast table had become an impromptu war council, with correspondence arriving hourly from London bearing increasingly disturbing news. Eleanor's parents had indeed been in negotiations with Lord Ashworth's representatives, and it appeared that financial desperation was driving both families toward a reconciliation that would restore the original marriage contract. "It's unconscionable," Lady Agatha declared, waving a letter from her own solicitor, "to treat a woman as if she were a commodity to be traded back and forth according to market conditions." The Duke, who had taken up residence in Lady Agatha's guest quarters, paced the morning room with the restless energy of a caged predator. He had shed his usual aristocratic composure, revealing a passionate intensity that made Eleanor's pulse quicken despite her distress. "We need to act quickly," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Every day we delay gives them more time to solidify their position. Eleanor, you must write to your parents immediately, making your position absolutely clear." Eleanor looked up from the untouched breakfast on her plate, her violet eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She had slept little the previous night, her mind churning with the implications of Richard's betrayal of Charlotte and his attempt to reclaim her as if nothing had happened. "What position?" she asked wearily. "That I refuse to be bartered like livestock. They've made it clear that my feelings are irrelevant to their calculations." "Then we make them relevant," the Duke replied fiercely. "You are not the same woman who fled from Ashworth Manor 3 months ago. You have found your voice, your purpose, your strength. Use them." Dr. Reed, who had arrived early that morning with additional intelligence from his contacts in London, looked up from his own correspondence with a troubled expression. "I'm afraid the situation is more complex than we initially understood," he said quietly. "Lord Ashworth's debts are apparently far more extensive than anyone realized. He owes money to some very dangerous people, the kind who don't accept excuses or delays." "What are you saying?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I'm saying that his desperation may drive him to extreme measures," Elias replied. "There are rumors that he's prepared to claim you were secretly engaged to him all along, that the ceremony with Charlotte was merely a public charade to cover a private understanding." The audacity of the suggestion left Eleanor speechless. Not only was Richard attempting to abandon the sister who had sacrificed everything for him, but he was prepared to rewrite history itself to serve his purposes. "He cannot possibly expect anyone to believe such a preposterous story," Lady Agatha said indignantly. "He doesn't need everyone to believe it," the Duke said grimly. "He only needs enough people in positions of authority to accept it. With the right legal representation and sufficient social pressure, he could make a compelling case that the original contract was never properly dissolved." Eleanor felt the walls of her new life beginning to crumble around her. Everything she had built in Bath, her independence, her intellectual pursuits, her growing sense of self-worth, seemed suddenly fragile in the face of legal machinations and family pressure. "There is one solution," Elias said quietly, his brown eyes fixed on Eleanor's face with an intensity that made her heart skip. "If you were to marry someone else immediately, Lord Ashworth's claims would become legally meaningless." The proposal hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Eleanor felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes upon her, each representing a different path forward. Lady Agatha's gaze held maternal concern and practical wisdom. The Duke's storm-grey eyes burned with an emotion she couldn't quite identify, but that made her breath catch in her throat. And Elias looked at her with the steady devotion of a man prepared to offer her everything he had. "Elias," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is not how I intended to propose," he said, rising from his chair to kneel beside hers. "I had hoped for more romantic circumstances, for time to court you properly. But if immediate marriage is what's required to protect your freedom, then I offer myself gladly." Eleanor looked down at his earnest face, seeing the genuine love and respect in his eyes. He was offering her safety, security, a life of purpose and meaning. Their work together at the clinic had shown her that they were compatible in temperament and values. He would be a kind husband, a devoted partner, a man who would never seek to diminish or control her. So why did acceptance feel like surrender rather than salvation? "Dr. Reed," the Duke said, his voice carefully controlled, "while your offer is undoubtedly well-intentioned, perhaps Lady Eleanor should be given time to consider all her options before making such a momentous decision." Elias's jaw tightened slightly. "With respect, Your Grace, time is precisely what we don't have. Every hour of delay strengthens Lord Ashworth's position and weakens Eleanor's ability to resist his claims." "And you believe that rushing her into marriage is the answer?" the Duke challenged, his aristocratic composure beginning to crack. "That she should sacrifice her freedom to choose for the sake of expediency?" "I believe," Elias replied, rising to face the Duke with quiet dignity, "that Eleanor deserves a husband who values her for herself, not for her social connections or her potential usefulness to his ambitions." The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Eleanor saw the Duke's eyes flash with dangerous fire. "Are you suggesting that my interest in Lady Eleanor's welfare is somehow self-serving?" "I'm suggesting," Elias said steadily, "that a duke's idea of protecting a woman might be very different from actually caring for her happiness." Eleanor felt the tension in the room reaching a breaking point and knew she had to intervene before the 2 men came to blows. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through their argument with surprising authority. "Both of you, please stop." She rose from her chair, moving to stand between them with the poise she had learned during her months in Bath. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, both of you, but I am not a prize to be fought over or a problem to be solved. I am a woman capable of making my own decisions." "Of course you are," Elias said immediately, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Eleanor, I didn't mean to imply—" "I know what you meant," she said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "And I'm grateful for your offer, truly I am. But I need time to think, to understand all the implications of whatever choice I make." The Duke stepped forward, his grey eyes intense with emotion. "Eleanor, there's something I must tell you, something I should have said months ago." Lady Agatha, who had been watching this drama unfold with the sharp attention of a woman well-versed in matters of the heart, suddenly rose from her chair. "Dr. Reed," she said smoothly, "perhaps you would be so kind as to accompany me to the morning room. I believe we should review the latest correspondence from London." Elias looked as though he wanted to protest, but Lady Agatha's tone brooked no argument. With obvious reluctance, he followed her from the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the Duke for the second time in as many days. The silence that followed was charged with an energy that made Eleanor's skin tingle with awareness. The Duke stood before her, his usual aristocratic composure replaced by something raw and vulnerable that took her breath away. "Alexander," she said softly, using his Christian name for the first time, "what is it you need to tell me?" He moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his grey eyes, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne that had haunted her dreams for months. "That I am in love with you," he said simply. "Desperately, completely, irrevocably in love with you. Eleanor felt her heart stop, then begin beating so rapidly she was certain he must hear it. "Alexander." "I know I have no right," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that my reputation, my past, makes me an unsuitable choice for a woman of your virtue and intelligence. But I cannot stand by and watch you marry another man without telling you how I feel." "Your reputation?" Eleanor asked, confused by his words. A bitter smile crossed his features. "You don't know, do you? Lady Agatha has been protecting you from the gossip, but I suppose you have a right to hear it from me." He moved to the window, staring out at the garden where they had walked the day before. "My father was a notorious rake who abandoned my mother for a series of mistresses. When he died, he left the estate bankrupt and the family name in ruins. I spent 10 years in India rebuilding our fortune and trying to restore some measure of respectability to the Blackwood name." Eleanor felt her heart ache for the pain she heard in his voice. "That's not your fault. You cannot be held responsible for your father's actions." "Can't I?" he asked, turning back to face her. "Society seems to think otherwise. They whisper that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, that I'm destined to follow in his footsteps. And perhaps they're right. Perhaps I am too damaged, too tainted by scandal, to offer you the kind of life you deserve." Eleanor moved toward him, her heart breaking at the self-doubt she saw in his eyes. "You saved me," she said softly. "When I was at my lowest point, when I thought my life was over, you appeared and showed me that I had choices. You introduced me to Lady Agatha, who helped me discover who I really am. How can you think yourself unworthy?" "Because," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want you so much that I'm terrified I'll destroy you the way my father destroyed my mother. Because I love you enough to step aside if that's what's best for you, even though it would kill me to do it." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his confession. Here was the truth she had been afraid to acknowledge, even to herself, that her feelings for Alexander went far beyond gratitude, far beyond the safe affection she felt for Elias. "And if I don't want you to step aside?" she asked, her voice trembling with the magnitude of what she was admitting. Hope flared in his grey eyes like a flame catching kindling. "Eleanor, are you saying—" "I'm saying that I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I've been trying to convince myself that what I felt was gratitude or admiration or anything other than love, but I can't lie to myself anymore." Alexander closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that made her heart soar. "Are you certain? Because once I kiss you, once I make you mine, there will be no going back. I won't be able to let you go." "I don't want you to let me go," Eleanor breathed, rising on her toes to meet him halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was everything Eleanor had dreamed of and nothing like she had expected. It was gentle and fierce, tender and passionate, a claiming and a surrender all at once. She felt as though she were coming alive for the first time, as though every kiss she had ever imagined had been a pale shadow of this reality. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said urgently, "not because of Lord Ashworth's threats or your family's pressure, but because you love me and I love you and we belong together." Eleanor felt joy bubble up inside her like champagne, effervescent and intoxicating. "Yes," she said, laughing through the tears that were streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you." He spun her around the room, both of them laughing with the giddy relief of finally acknowledging what had been building between them for months. When he set her down, his expression grew serious. "We'll have to move quickly," he said. "I can obtain a special license, and we can be married within the week. Once you're my Duchess, Lord Ashworth's claims will be meaningless." Eleanor nodded, her mind already racing with the implications of her choice. "What about Elias? I need to speak with him to explain." "He's a good man," Alexander said gently. "He'll understand that you've chosen love over convenience, passion over safety. And perhaps someday he'll find a woman who can love him the way he deserves to be loved. The sound of approaching footsteps made them spring apart, though Alexander kept hold of her hand as Lady Agatha and Dr. Reed returned to the room. One look at their joined hands and radiant faces told the story more clearly than words ever could. Lady Agatha's face broke into a delighted smile. "Well," she said with satisfaction, "it's about time you two stopped dancing around each other." Elias's expression was harder to read, a mixture of disappointment and resignation that made Eleanor's heart ache for him. "I see," he said quietly. "I suppose congratulations are in order." "Elias," Eleanor began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Please," he said with quiet dignity, "don't apologize for following your heart. I offered you safety and security, but he offers you love and passion. I cannot compete with that, nor would I want to." He moved toward the door, then paused to look back at her one last time. "I hope you'll be very happy, Eleanor. You deserve nothing less." After he left, Eleanor felt a pang of guilt for the pain she had caused such a good man. But Alexander's arms around her reminded her that sometimes the heart's choice was not the safe choice, not the practical choice, but the only choice that mattered. "When shall we tell your parents?" Lady Agatha asked practically. "After we're married," Alexander replied firmly. "I won't give them the opportunity to interfere or create obstacles. Eleanor has made her choice, and I intend to protect that choice with everything I have." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, feeling safer and more cherished than she ever had in her life. The girl who had fled from Ashworth Manor in shame and humiliation was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her strength, her purpose, and her true love. But even as she revelled in her newfound happiness, she couldn't help but wonder what Charlotte's reaction would be when she learned that her discarded sister had not only survived her betrayal, but had triumphed beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The thought of facing her family as the Duchess of Ravenshollow filled her with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The final confrontation was coming, and Eleanor would need every ounce of the strength she had discovered in Bath to face the people who had once controlled her destiny. But with Alexander by her side, she felt ready to face anything, even the reckoning that awaited her in the world she had left behind. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the conservatory of Ravenshollow Castle, watching the morning mist rise from the Scottish Highlands that stretched endlessly beyond the ancient stone walls. The castle, perched dramatically on a cliff overlooking Loch Katrine, was everything she had never dared to dream of. Not just a home, but a sanctuary where she could flourish as both a duchess and the woman she had chosen to become. The transformation in her life had been nothing short of miraculous. As the Duchess of Ravenshollow, she had discovered that her new position came not with restrictions, but with unprecedented freedom to pursue her passions. Alexander had encouraged her writing, and her essays on social reform were now published regularly in London's most prestigious journals. Together, they had established a foundation that funded schools for working-class children and medical clinics for the poor, combining her organizational talents with his resources and influence. "Your Grace," came a soft voice behind her, and Eleanor turned to see Mrs. MacLeod, the castle's housekeeper, approaching with the morning correspondence. The elderly Scottish woman had initially been sceptical of the English Duchess, but Eleanor's genuine warmth and lack of pretension had quickly won her over. "Thank you, Mrs. MacLeod," Eleanor said, accepting the silver tray. "Has His Grace returned from Edinburgh yet?" "Aye, Your Grace. He's in his study, reviewing the plans for the new school in the village. He asked me to tell you that the architect's drawings have arrived." Eleanor's face lit up with excitement. The village school was their latest project, designed to provide education for children whose families worked on the estate. It would be the most modern facility of its kind in Scotland, with proper heating, electric lighting, and a library that would rival those found in Edinburgh's finest institutions. As she sorted through the letters, one particular envelope caught her attention. The elegant script and London postmark made her heart skip. It was from Charlotte. Eleanor hadn't heard from her sister since their wedding day, when Charlotte had sent a brief, coldly formal note of congratulation that had been more insult than blessing. With trembling fingers, Eleanor broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting that had once seemed so carefree and now appeared strained and desperate. "Dearest Eleanor, I hope this letter finds you well and happy in your new life. I've heard the most wonderful reports of your work in Scotland and your success as a writer. Mother showed me your latest article in the Times about factory conditions, and I must confess I was quite impressed by your eloquence and passion. I'm writing to you now because I find myself in rather desperate circumstances, and you are the only person I can turn to. Richard's financial situation has become quite dire, far worse than any of us imagined when we married. The creditors have seized Ashworth Manor, and we have been forced to take lodgings in a rather modest house in Bloomsbury. But that is not the worst of it, Eleanor. Richard has changed so completely from the charming man I fell in love with. The financial pressures have made him bitter and cruel. He blames me for his troubles, saying that if he had married you as originally planned, your family's connections might have saved him. He drinks heavily now and has taken to... Well, I cannot bring myself to write the details, but suffice it to say that marriage to him has become a source of constant fear and misery. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I did. I know that my actions caused you tremendous pain and humiliation. But I am desperate, Eleanor, and I have nowhere else to turn. Could you possibly find it in your heart to help me? I don't need money. I would never presume to ask for that. But perhaps you might know of some respectable position I could take, some way I could support myself independently. I have been thinking so much lately about the choices we made, and I realize now how foolish I was to believe that passion alone could sustain a marriage. You were always the wiser of us, the one who thought before acting. I should have listened to you, should have valued your counsel instead of dismissing it as mere jealousy. Please forgive me if you can. And please, if there is any kindness left in your heart for your foolish sister, help me find a way to escape this nightmare I have created for myself. Your repentant sister, Charlotte Eleanor, sank into a nearby chair, the letter trembling in her hands. The mixture of emotions that washed over her was complex and overwhelming: pity for Charlotte's suffering, anger at the irony of her situation, and a deep sadness for the sister she had once loved so dearly. "Eleanor?" Alexander's voice came from the doorway, and she looked up to see him striding toward her, his face creased with concern. Even after 6 months of marriage, the sight of him still made her heart race. He had grown even more handsome in their time together. The harsh lines of stress that had marked his features when they first met, now softened by contentment and love. "What is it, darling?" he asked, settling beside her and taking her free hand in his. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Eleanor replied, handing him the letter. "It's from Charlotte." Alexander read the letter in silence, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. When he finished, he set it aside and pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her close against his chest. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "This must be incredibly difficult for you." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I don't know what to feel," she admitted. "Part of me wants to help her. She's still my sister, despite everything. But another part of me remembers how she looked at our wedding reception, how she laughed while I fled in humiliation." "What does your heart tell you to do?" Alexander asked, his fingers stroking gently through her hair. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "My heart tells me that I'm not the same woman who was destroyed by her betrayal," she said finally. "I'm stronger now, more secure in who I am and what I want from life. Charlotte's actions led me to you, to this life, to becoming the person I was meant to be. In a strange way, I owe her a debt of gratitude." Alexander pulled back to look at her, his grey eyes warm with admiration. "You continue to amaze me," he said. Your capacity for forgiveness, for seeing the larger picture, is extraordinary. I don't want to forgive her for her sake, Eleanor clarified. I want to forgive her for mine. Carrying anger and resentment would only diminish the happiness we've built together. Then what do you want to do? Eleanor stood and moved to the window, looking out at the highland landscape that had become so dear to her. In the distance, she could see the village where their new school would soon stand, a symbol of hope and progress that she and Alexander were building together. I want to offer her a position, she said finally, not out of pity, but because everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life. We're establishing a girls' school in Edinburgh next year. She could teach there, have her own income, her own independence. Alexander joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. Are you certain, working with Charlotte again, seeing her regularly, it might be more difficult than you imagine? It might be, Eleanor agreed, but it might also be healing. And if she's truly changed, if she's learned from her mistakes as I've learned from mine, then perhaps we can find a way to be sisters again. And if she hasn't changed, if this is merely another manipulation— Eleanor leaned back against his chest, feeling his strength and love surrounding her like armor. Then I'll know I tried, and I'll have no regrets. But I won't let her hurt me again, Alexander. I'm not that vulnerable girl anymore. No, he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You're the Duchess of Ravenshollow, a published author, a social reformer, and the strongest woman I know. You can handle whatever Charlotte throws at you. Eleanor turned in his arms, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. We can handle it, she corrected. Together. 3 weeks later, Charlotte arrived at Ravenshollow Castle, looking nothing like the radiant bride who had stolen Eleanor's intended husband. She was thinner, her once lustrous dark hair now dull and carelessly arranged, her clothes well made, but showing signs of wear and careful mending. Most striking of all was the change in her eyes. The mischievous sparkle that had once charmed everyone around her had been replaced by a wary sadness that made Eleanor's heart ache despite everything. Eleanor received her in the castle's elegant drawing room, a space that perfectly reflected her new status and confidence. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her coloring beautifully, and the Ravenshollow emeralds, a wedding gift from Alexander, adorned her throat and ears. She looked every inch the Duchess she had become, poised and elegant and utterly secure in her position. Eleanor, Charlotte said softly, dropping into a curtsy that was both respectful and deeply humble. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't certain you would. Please sit down, Eleanor replied, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace. Would you care for tea? That would be lovely, thank you. Eleanor rang for refreshments, using the time to study her sister more closely. Charlotte's beauty was still evident, but it was a faded beauty, like a flower that had been left too long without water. The confident, vivacious girl who had once commanded every room she entered had been replaced by a woman who seemed to be trying to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. You look wonderful, Charlotte said when the tea had been served and they were alone again. Marriage clearly agrees with you, and this castle, it's magnificent, like something from a fairy tale. Thank you, Eleanor replied simply. Alexander and I are very happy here. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. Finally, Charlotte set down her teacup with trembling hands. Eleanor, I need you to know how sorry I am, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Not just for what I did, but for how I did it. I was so selfish, so thoughtless. I convinced myself that I was following my heart, but the truth is I was just indulging my vanity and my desire to have what belonged to someone else. Eleanor studied her sister's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But all she saw was genuine remorse and a pain that seemed to go bone deep. What happened, Charlotte? She asked gently. In your letter you mentioned that Richard had changed. Charlotte's composure cracked. and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "He was never the man I thought he was," she whispered. "The charm, the romance, it was all an act to win me away from you. Once we were married and his financial troubles became apparent, he showed his true nature. He's cruel, Eleanor, viciously, deliberately cruel." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing faded bruises on her wrist that made Eleanor gasp in horror. "He blames me for everything. For his debts, for the loss of his estate, for the fact that he chose the wrong sister. He says that if he had married you as planned, your family's connections and your dowry would have saved him." Eleanor felt a surge of protective anger toward her sister, followed immediately by a profound gratitude for her own escape from such a fate. "Charlotte, you must leave him immediately. No woman should endure such treatment." "I tried," Charlotte said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, "but I have no money of my own, nowhere to go. My friends have all abandoned me. Apparently being married to a bankrupt wife-beater is quite unfashionable in London society." The bitter irony in her voice was painful to hear. Charlotte, who had once been the toast of every social gathering, was now discovering how quickly society could turn its back on those who fell from grace. "That's why I wrote to you," Charlotte continued. "You were always the strong one, the intelligent one. I thought perhaps you might have some advice, some suggestion for how I might support myself." Eleanor set down her own teacup and moved to sit beside her sister on the sofa. "I have more than advice," she said firmly. "I have a proposition." Charlotte looked up with hope, flickering in her eyes for the first time since her arrival. "Alexandra and I are establishing a girls' school in Edinburgh," Eleanor explained. "We need teachers, women who understand both the importance of education and the challenges that young ladies face in finding their place in the world. The position would provide you with a comfortable salary, your own lodgings, and complete independence from Richard." "You would do that for me?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything I've done to you?" "I'm not doing it for you," Eleanor said honestly. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and because I believe everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life. But Charlotte, I need you to understand something. This is not charity, and it's not forgiveness. This is an opportunity for you to prove that you've learned from your mistakes and grown into a better person." Charlotte nodded eagerly. "I have learned, Eleanor. I've learned that beauty and charm mean nothing without character. I've learned that passion without respect is just selfishness, and I've learned that the sister I betrayed was worth a dozen men like Richard Ashworth." Eleanor felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. This was not the same spoiled, thoughtless girl who had stolen her fiancé. This was a woman who had been broken by her choices and was trying to rebuild herself into something better. "There are conditions," Eleanor continued. "You will have no contact with Richard beyond what's necessary to obtain a legal separation. You will conduct yourself with absolute propriety in your position, and you will never, ever attempt to trade on your connection to me or Alexander for personal gain." "I accept all of your conditions," Charlotte said immediately. "Eleanor, I know I can never undo the pain I caused you, but I swear I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of this second chance." Eleanor reached out and took her sister's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of recent hardship and honest work. "Then welcome to your new life, Charlotte. I hope you'll make the most of it." As they sat together in the drawing room of Ravenshollow Castle, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. The humiliation that had once seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of everything she had never dared to dream. She had found love, purpose, and a strength she never knew she possessed, and now perhaps she had found something even more precious. The possibility of redemption, not just for Charlotte, but for the bond between sisters that had once seemed irreparably broken. Outside the castle windows, the Scottish Highlands stretched toward the horizon, vast and beautiful, and full of endless possibilities. Eleanor had learned to bloom where she was planted, and in doing so she had discovered that sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow in the most unexpected places. The girl, who had once been defined by other people's expectations, had become a woman who wrote her own story. And as she looked toward the future with Alexander by her side, and a sister who might yet become a friend, Eleanor knew that the best chapters of her life were still waiting to be written. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy her had instead set her free, and she would spend the rest of her days grateful for the courage to choose love over safety, authenticity over approval, and hope over fear. In the end, that was the greatest triumph of all. Not just surviving her trials, but emerging from them as the woman she was always meant to be. If this story of resilience, love, and second chances has touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel for more tales of triumph over adversity and share in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed like a devastating setback but turned out to be the beginning of something wonderful? Your stories inspire me to keep sharing these tales of hope and transformation. Until next time, remember that sometimes our greatest defeats become our most magnificent victories.